Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 12 of What If Naruto was the Jinchuriki of the world leader. If you guys enjoy this what if, and want to see part 13 of it, comment down below and let me know. And go ahead and check out other what ifs in the channel. Before we start, please do support for more awesome content. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, and also share this video with your friends. So let's start this video. The stasis seal reached all across the arena, including the Kage box, but it didn't affect the Kages as much, leaving them able to speak. And in some ways, that was an even worse sort of torture. Hiruzen strained against his invisible bonds, the muscles in his neck corded, and his face mottled with the effort to move from his panic, as the shinobi he considered a grandson was impaled by a spear made of paper, wielded by a woman who flew on wings that also seemed to be made of paper. Her black coat decorated by red clouds flapping in the sudden breeze. He didn't scream. He only made a strangled groan as his grandson's corpse hit the ground with a final thud. A shadow passed overhead, and a person landed in front of Sarutobi and the other frozen Kage. Lank black hair framed the pale paper-white face of an androgynous man, his golden, slitted eyes standing out due to the purple markings under them, a thin, playful smile curling his lips. Orochimaru. Hiruzen stated in tone colder than dry ice. If you had something to do with this, I am going to murder you. He stated simply. The snake Sonin cocked an eyebrow at his sensei, smiling even more. Oh please, sensei. He rebuked with a friendly tone. As if I had the tiniest part in this. There's not nearly enough panache in this presentation. I mean, come on, I get the whole giant stasis seal, that's pretty cool, and Konan flying down to stab Naruto-kun was indeed pretty dramatic, but not my style. Had the exams been in Konoha, though, that would be an entirely different question. Oh yeah? Jiraiya asked challengingly. And what would be your style? Orochimaru shrugged, displaying his empty hands in a gesture of cluelessness. I can't say for certain, but there would have been snakes. Big ones. They're kind of my thing, you know. The Sandaime took a deep, bracing breath. So, if you had no part in this, my student, the title was said mockingly, then why, exactly, are you here? Eh? The pale Sanin shrugged again. I heard rumors about an attack on the Chunin exams. A bunch of Nukenin gathering to attack the villages that got rid of them for one reason or another, and I was like, hey, well they're attacking everyone, why don't I sneak in and kill my sensei? And here I am. Now excuse me for a second, I need to get out my sword. What were you doing at the Chunin exams in the first place? I asked with narrowed eyes. Orochimaru paused. Well, you see, I was just looking around. He stopped, tapping his chin in thought, muttering to himself. Wait, why am I lying? I don't care what these people think about me. Oh, I was totally spying on your genin. He announced cheerfully. Watching the most interesting genin, seeing if they had any special bloodlines or whatever so I could poach or possibly get their blood so I could study them. If Naruto-kun's body wasn't cooling right now, he'd be at the top of my list. Mei, her lips trembling at the sight of Naruto's corpse, turned an acid glare on the Sanin. You're a sick bastard, Orochimaru. She muttered through clenched teeth. Oh boo-hoo-hoo, he made mocking crying noises at her, wiping away faux tears. The only person I could touch for more than a few seconds died right in front of me, and now my family line will die out forever. So I decided to call someone who had nothing to do with the event's mean names, because I'm a little bitch, boo-hoo. The snake Sanin smirked at the horrified, outraged look on the Mizukage's face. And if your blood didn't melt my syringes, I'd totally get a few samples from you. Orochimaru gagged slightly, a lump traveling up his throat, and a head of purple snake emerging from his mouth. It then opened its mouth, a long, double-edged blade emerging from its mouth, which the Sanin took by the hilt, and the snake disappeared back down his throat. That took me by surprise, just a little bit. Rasa, his face mostly impassive, watched the snake Sanin wipe his mouth, his eyebrows high up on his forehead. That was fucked up. He commented, almost blandly, except for the undercurrent of disgust in his voice. I see you've gotten so used to sucking dick you've decided to swallow a snake. Jiraiya remarked with a smirk. And I see you still haven't felt the touch of woman since Tsunade beat you up the last time you met her. Orochimaru shot back. And, newsflash, I'm not gay, nor am I a pedophile, thank you very much Jiraiya. You asshole. You just had to spread that rumor, didn't you? If he could have, the Toad Sanin would have crossed his arms. You deserved it. Orochimaru flapped one of his hands like a mouth. Oh, blah, 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 I'm so mature, I'm going to spread gay rumors about my straight teammate. Now shut up, I'm going to stab sensei in the face. He looked up. That was you, by the way. I was mocking you. He pointed the tip of his sword at Hiruzen's face, inches away from his left eye, with his tongue stuck out the side of his mouth in concentration. Why are you doing this, Orochimaru? Hiruzen asked blandly, glaring at his former student. Why bother? Can you stop moving your head? Orochimaru complained childishly. I'm trying to stab in the face in such a way that the last thing you see before you die is my smile, and I need to impale your brain just right. And besides, why not? I mean, have you ever heard a story about a wayward evil student where they didn't kill their teacher? I didn't do it first thing, so I need to catch up or my villain cred will go right out the window. The snake Sonin made a sound of triumph as he found the correct spot and pulled his arm back, only to stop at the sound of rushing flames. Pausing, the pale shinobi turned and looked down at the field. At the sudden sound, Konan turned around and fixed the corpse that was Naruto with surprised look as light, red, orange and purple, streamed off of his body, the breeze from the event causing her cloak to flap against her body. In the stands, Mira's eyes went white as flames began to engulf Naruto's body, crackling and popping as they consumed flesh. But, instead of leaving nothing but bones behind, the flames and the light swirled around the body, hiding it from view. Suddenly, the corpse was lifted onto his knees, and the light swirled around it once more before diving back into the chest. With a soft hiss, the flames died down, revealing Naruto Uzumaki, breathing and blinking, the hole in his chest completely gone. He looked around the arena for a second, fixing on Konan. She was so shocked by the turn of events, the angel of Akatsuki took a step back. Then, Naruto looked down at his hands. His human hands. And his eyes went wide, looking back up at Konan with a horrified face. "You didn't," he murmured quietly. Then, he grunted in pain, clutching his hands to his chest as something squished loudly inside of him, kneeling on his hands and knees, his eyes fixed on his fingers as they began to stretch and grow, the joints and bones standing out through his paling skin. Naruto tried to muffle the cries in his throat and failed, releasing a scream of agony as his entire body began to change. His spine stretched, new, larger vertebrae pushing the human ones aside as they began to grow, pulling his skin taut over his frame. His shoulders began to expand, his arms and legs cracking as the bones were changed, violently, from those of a human to those of a dragon. His eyes bled as the blue was drained away, changed to a hellish mix of red and orange, his jaw cracking as his teeth grew into black fangs, locking his mouth shut, but not silencing the screams coming from his throat, nor the squelches that echoed as his organs shifted. Naruto began to grow, his nose pushing out from his face as his hair fell out, leaving his head bald, his skin darkening to gray, hunched over, his back was bare to the horrified eyes of the crowd, and underneath the skin of his back and his head, something writhed and shifted under the surface. A spear of bone shot from his back, forming into a tail, his nails lengthened and gouged the earth, the writhing on his back increased until the newly formed bones of his wings and horns ripped through his skin, splattering nearly black blood that boiled and hissed as it touched the ground. The skeletal structure of his wings shuddered, and spasmed as veins, followed by nerves and muscles slithered over bone, black, scaled skin covering it as the membrane between the bones, knitted itself across them. Scales grew in as his knees cracked and shifted backwards, the noise echoing like a pair of thunderclaps, racing over his skin like a wave as Naruto continued to grow, his pain screams still echoing from his throat. He reached 20 feet in length, and continued, his tail becoming larger with a spiked mace-like tip, another pair of horns coming in behind the first set. His frame, though covered in black scales, was still slight but long, and not for long. His muscles began shifting and twisting and cracking and squishing, as they grew to support his weight, filling out his body. His voice began to waver and deepen as his internal organs finished changing, the agonized screams becoming the pained roars of a great beast. And suddenly, the change was done. Where once lay a boy, 5 feet and 7 inches in height, there now stood a dragon. Black scales shone in the light, the curved spikes like scythes, the wings spanning 30 feet for each wing, long, black talons gouging the rocky earth like a hot knife through butter, the tail like a mace crumbling the earth with every twitch, waves of heat roiling from his mouth with every breath. Nearly 50 feet long, from the tip of his tail to the tip of his snout. Several hundred tons of bones tougher than any rock, organs hardier than any other, scales thick enough to weather any heat, talons sharp enough to cut through stone, a voice more powerful than any other. The mind and ingenuity of a warrior, and muscles strong enough to move all of it with nearly feline grace. And all of it was angry. Naruto stared down at Konan, his large, hellish eyes gleaming rage and pain. He pulled his head back, opened his jaw, and roared. Nothing could match that noise. Not the thunder of a million drums nor the footsteps of a million troops, the combined sound of a million thunderclaps and tongues of lightning. And all of it was directed at her. She had felt fear. Many times before in her life, in fact. The fear of dying in pain, the fear of watching all she protected be destroyed, the fear of failure. But Konan had never felt like she did then. Like an insect, a lower life form that none could be bothered to swat. She felt like that. Except she had stung the biggest thing in the room, and drawn its attention to her. The force of the roar nearly blasted her off her feet, only the ingrained response of sticking her feet to the ground with chakra stopped her from being flung into the air. She looked down the maw of the dragon, and saw white, blue and red flames down his throat, begging to be unleashed on her. She saw hell in the mouth of the dragon. And so, Konan fled. She spread her paper wings as wide as they could go, and with one mighty flap born of desperation and fear for her life, propelled herself high into the air and flew for her life. Naruto spread his wings and leaped into the air with a grace that belied his size, cutting through the wind like a knife, pursuing the fleeing Kunoichi with an angry roar. Drawing his head back, he released a ball of swirling fire at Konan, who dived to avoid it, the heat singeing her paper and causing her to cry out in fear. Konan, seeing that he could fly faster her, decided on a more extreme course of action. She flew higher up into the air and drew on her power, dispersing into a swarm of paper that scattered to the wind. Bellowing in rage, Naruto roared, "Yul!" Sending an even larger ball of fire after the scattering paper, huffing in dissatisfaction as it only reduced a small portion to ash. Shaking his head and finally recovering from the pain that clouded his senses, Naruto huffed and turned around, flying back to the arena as a battle broke out. After watching Naruto go through his transformation, Orochimaru only had one thing to say. "That was fucked up," he muttered in a disturbed tone as Konan fled. Hiruzen was pale, as were Mei and Jiraiya. The agonized screams still echoed in their heads, and it was the sound that only those under the worst, mind-breaking and soul-shredding kind of torture would emit. With a loud snapping sound, the stasis seal dropped, and everyone was free to move again. To the Nukenin and mercenaries down the field, that meant it was open season, and they began to draw weapons and fire jutsu into the crowd. The ninja from every village that had come to watch the exams responded in kind as the weaker ones moved to evacuate the civilians. Orochimaru ducked under a beheading strike from Zabuza, twisted away from a dust release technique from Inoki, slithered through a barrage of Jaiken strikes from the eye-patched Miss Jonin, and flipped over a strike aimed at his legs from Jiraiya, and landed on the roof of the Kage box. The Kages and their bodyguards following immediately. The snake Sonin cursed loudly to himself. "I monologued for too damn long," he cried angrily. "Shit. It's time for you to face justice, Orochimaru," Jiraiya shouted, firmly in his stance. Orochimaru simply gave them all a middle finger, before biting down on the digit and drawing blood, which he swiped across the snake tattoo on his arm. Bye. With a puff of white smoke, the Sonin disappeared in the telltale cloud of a reverse summoning jutsu. There was silence for a second, before Jiraiya shouted, "That son of a bitch." I shook the sudden shock off, turning to look at his village's mercenaries and Nukenin wreaked havoc. "Ninja of Kumagakure and allies. To arms. Protect the citizens and drive back the intruders," he roared as lightning sparked around his form. The center of the arena had become a battleground as the loyal ninja of the various villages faced off against those that had abandoned them for various reasons. Kakashi's chakra saber clashed with the long kunai of a man with several scars decorating his face, before he kicked the other man's knee out of alignment, and drove his blade through their neck, neatly separating their head from their shoulders. "Kakashi-sensei," Sakura shouted as she hurled a pair of kunai into the backs of two ninja that were attacking Chaoji. "What do we do?" He shrugged, ducking under a swing that ruffled his hair before driving his saber up under the ribs of his attacker, and piercing their heart. "Kill as many as you can." Kakashi clenched his left hand into a fist, lightning crackling around it, before dashing forward and driving the Wichidori through the heart of Kunoichi, as she went to impale Lee from behind. "And who knows, you might even get a field promotion." I danced through the crowd, bones cracking and breaking from the force of his blows. "Youth," he cried, flames gathering around his fists. Vegito and her sister dashed out into Kumo, lightning flying from Samui's mouth to pierce a ninja that had his back turned to her. Both were more than worried about their fiancé, but pushed that aside to focus on saving what had once been their home. Vegito took a deep breath and flipped through seals before spitting up 5 rats made of fire. "Kaiten. Thank you, Nizumi," she called as the chakra construct scuttled underfoot, seeking out enemy ninja, and detonating when they found them. They joined the fight that raged between the forces on the streets, a battle on every street corner and in every alley. A figure landed on the roof of a nearby building, her blue-polished nails flickering through hand seals as she inhaled, her lungs expanding to hold more air. "Futten, Habana no Aiki," Mei shouted as dark red mist poured from her lips, drifting down to settle in the streets. Every enemy ninja who inhaled even a bit of the mist began to hack and choke, their skin bubbling as the acid ate away at their flesh. The loyal ninja, seeing that they weren't being affected by the acid mist, finished off their enemies and hopped onto the roofs to help the others. As Kumo ninja fought against their enemies, a figure wreathed in lightning darted through a sector of his village, maiming every Nukenin that got within his range with his hands. It came to a stop after ending the lives of a street full of mercenaries, looking up as a large form with the head of a bull, the arms of a man, and the lower body of an octopus smashed down on his enemies, collapsing a pair of buildings as it shouted, "You're all gonna die." And the amazing 8 don't lie, yo. "Damn it, B," I angrily shouted at the figure. "I told you to watch for collateral damage." He blitzed through the village, killing every ninja in his path, until he reached the Hachibi and leaped into the air, drawing his lightning in around his right fist. "Raiden. Tetsutsume." He punched the creature directly in the face, causing it to jerk back. "Ow. That was my face, bro. This ain't the time or the place, yo." It shouted at him as a pair of tentacles whipped through the air and crushed a few ninja into paste. "Well then watch out for the buildings, B, or my iron claw will be the least of your worries." The Raikage shouted at his brother. "And you're the one who will be helping them rebuild." Suki ducked under a swipe from his sword, getting a kick to the face for her trouble, as the Jonin attacking her laughed, the scratched-out symbol of Iwa on his hideate gleaming. "I saw your tricks, little Uchiha," he shouted as she tumbled through the air, managing to land on her feet. "None of your damn relatives could kill me in the Third War. What makes you think you have a chance now?" The mace in his hand whistled through the air as it came towards her head. Hanabi leapt at the man, striking his arm with her fists, rupturing the Tenketsu, causing him to drop the weapon. Suki took advantage of his pain and swung her katana up, slicing through the flesh of his stomach, causing blood and no small amount of his intestines to spill out, and the Jonin collapsed to the ground. "Thanks," she said gratefully to her teammate. "Just don't go after another Jonin by yourself." The Hyuga replied as she jumped and spun, her chakra-enhanced kick cleaving through the skull of a Genin-level Nukenin. Bodies littered the floor of the arena as the battle continued. An explosive tag exploded near Suki and Hanabi, throwing them to the floor as a brutal-looking woman with an axe hovered over them, shouting glee. The roar ripped through the air as the large black form of Naruto slipped through the air, the ground shaking and cracking as he landed. He loomed over the kunoichi, who began to shiver under his red gaze, before his head darted down and snapped her up, swallowing her whole, weapon and all. The battle paused as Naruto released a bellowing roar, picking out his targets and ending their lives with his talons or his fangs, eating some whole and crushing others under his limbs, his tail swinging out and pulverizing bodies. Kakashi whistled, waving his hand to get the dragon's attention. He tried not to flinch at the gaze that was leveled on him. "Good job, Naruto," he shouted, giving him a thumbs up. He couldn't tell, but the Jonin got the feeling that Naruto was smiling. "You as well, Kakashi." His voice was low and rumbling, as if a rock slide had been given a voice. Many ninja jumped at the sound of the words, not knowing that the great dragon could speak. "I will continue to support our forces, but the rest of the village is still under attack." "Gotcha," Kakashi yelled in reply. "Everyone, into Kumo." Naruto lifted off once more and swooped over the buildings, calling out, mid-verse Sean. The loyal ninja down below felt their energy returning as their bodies began to glow with ethereal light, and they fought harder and faster than before. He passed by a building, atop which stood several Nukenin firing jutsu into the battle below. Naruto breathed deep and shouted, "Afo Kra." A wide stream of frost streamed from his maw, washing over the Nukenin like a blizzard, freezing them in place. As Naruto flew away, Haku landed on the roof and clapped her hands, shattering the ice and ending the lives of the ninja, before twisting her hands and sending the shards screaming through the air to impale the enemies down below. Sarutobi landed before a group of Nukenin, his robes and hat discarded for his battle armor, his staff clenched in one hand. With a single half-seal, he summoned a shadow clone, and both began to flip through entirely different sets of seals. The clone spat out a river of mud that formed into a dragon as the real Hokage stood behind it, his hand under his lips. He breathed a dragon of fire into the worm of mud, and the clone beneath used his hands to direct the dragon to open its mouth. Combination Jutsu. Dragon Siege Pots. They both called as bullets of baked clay shot from the mud dragon's mouth. When the bullets impacted into an enemy, they exploded from the fire inside, sending white-hot shards of clay into the ninja in the area. The loyal ninja nearby watched in awe as the Hokage cleared an entire area of enemies with a pair of jutsu, being forcefully reminded why the old man had been feared throughout the world. Itsuki laughed in glee as her chains struck like snakes, the lightning-infused link snapping out at a blinding speed to crush bone and flesh. Her new friend Satsu cackling behind her as swung her tri-bladed scythe, removing limbs and heads, and spilling blood with wild abandon. Samui and Yujito worked together as only siblings could, not even needing to speak to know what the other would do. Yujito threw out streams of flames while Samui speared their enemies with lightning, slashing and stabbing with her tanto, as they spasmed under the crackle of electricity. Hanabi and Hinata were much the same. Hinata, with her grasp of chakra and the Jaiken, would defend them from jutsu and weapons, while Hanabi would attack, her vicious, chakra-laced kicks that could cut through flesh and bone. Mijiko and Tenten stood atop a building, hurling weapons into the masses below, picking off Nukenin. The Hyuga Kunoichi reached into her pouch and produced 2 more black shuriken, narrowing her yellowed eyes, the veins around them bulging, picking out another pair of targets, and flicking her wrists. The 2 metal stars zipped through the air, stabbing into the heads of 2 Kunoichi, saving the life of a Kiri ninja. She looked up as the Nukenin hopped onto the roof behind them, charging at their backs. Nijiko spun around to deal with him, but paused as a shadow grew behind the Kumo deserter. Naruto swooped down, closing his taloned hand around the Nukenin's body, flapping his wings to gain height and hurling him into the air, leaving him to fall to his death. He flew around the building once more, sending a wink at the 2 Konoha Kunoichi before leaving to wreak more havoc. In another sector, Garen threw her arms out, white sand spilling from her gore to sweep through the streets, making every enemy who touched it fall asleep. By her side, Tamari swung her battle fan, sending miniature cyclones spinning through the streets that picked up Nukenin, and sent them flying into the air, buildings and each other. Ayla snarled as her bowstring rang, another arrow leaving her bow to bury itself in the eye of an enemy as Mir, clad in her dragonbone armor, separated another head from its body, turning on her heel to shout, "Fuzz Roda." The wave of force rushed down the street, pulling everyone in its path down, and the hunters took them out with well-placed arrows. The Nukenin had not planned this attack out, their leader realized with an impending sense of death hanging over his head. They had thought that they would be supported by the angel of the Akatsuki, that they would be able to strike before the stasis seal ended. Instead, the angel had fled, and they had spent too much of their energy watching the transformation taking place in front of them, and had ended the seal too early. The former Kari shinobi paled as more of their forces were cut down. Deciding that discretion was the better part of valor, he called out, "Retreat," and made for the side of the mountain Kuma was placed on, only to be stopped upon coming face to face with Mei, her smile still firmly affixed to her face, but the shadows casting an eerie pallor over her beautiful features. "And just where are you going, Jikito Akashio, former right-hand man of the Yondaime Mizukage?" she asked sweetly, her fingers twitching from the urge to strangle the man in front of her. "I don't have time to deal with you, filthy blooded whore," he shouted, spitting a wave of water from his mouth. Her answering ball of lava caused the water to explode into a cloud of steam, just as he had expected, allowing him to bounce off the side of a building and run away. Jikito ran again, and bounced off of something, tumbling onto his back. Looking up, he paled even further, to the roots of his dark brown hair. Standing before him with his arms crossed over his wide, muscled chest, was the Raikage, scowling down at him with lightning sparking off of his body. Not even attempting to fight, the former ninja commander of Kirigakure threw down all the smoke bombs in his possession, running away from Mei and heading towards the edge once more. He began to smile as the edge came into view, only to falter as he realized that he was slowing down, something weighing heavily on his shoulders. Jikito began to panic more as he glanced to the side, seeing the Kazekage staring down at him with an impassive face, as gold dust floated in the air around. A sudden cracking sound was joined by blinding pain as both his kneecaps were shattered by a bow staff, dropping him to the ground, looking up into the angry face of Hiruzen Tsurutobi. "We need to have a little talk," the Hokage said conversationally. But first, I spoke up, bending down and picking the man up by the back of his head. "You need to see just how badly you failed." The Raikage, joined by the Kazekage, the Mizukage, the Tsuchikage and the Hokage, dragged the man to the edge of Kumo, allowing him to see the forms of the other Nukenin as they floated down the mountainside, the white parachute standing out from the light gray clouds. Jikito smiled to himself, imaging some of the others getting away, but that faded as well when a roar rang through the air. The massive black form of Naruto cut through the clouds, the words he spoke plainly audible even from that distance. "The Altur Shul." A jet of white hot flames spewed from his maw, incinerating everything in its path to less than ash, smoke rising as the fire burned the air itself. The leader of the Nukenin slumped the Raikage's grip, as Mei stepped up to face him, restraining his hands with ninja wire. "You have failed utterly," she whispered, her face hard and lips thin. It tightened his grip and electrocuted the man in hand into unconsciousness. The gathered loyal ninja forces cheered as the retreating forces were destroyed. Naruto released a triumphant bugle, sailing through the clouds with his wings outstretched to the maximum. "You are full dragon now, my son," Alduin roared triumphantly in his mind. "Our enemies will cower before you, vying the Kundinok, son of the Alduin." Something pulsed through the air, echoing throughout the entire world as Alduin named his son, something that caused many to shiver in abject terror, and others to pause and look up at the sky, as if an invisible shadow had passed over the sun. Even in Aetherius, 9 beings took notice of the pulse. In his realm of oblivion, Marin's Dagon threw his horned head back and laughed, loud and long. Meridia looked up from tending her garden, smiling gently, Telly bouncing excitedly beside her. Naruto cruised to a landing in front of the gates of Kumo, where he was met by the Kages, and the majority of the ninja gathered there. The Genin, the Jonin, his friends and allies and lovers looking at him with awe and happiness, despite the wounds they had taken. Despite his size, he landed softly, the earth barely disturbed by his rest. With a soft exhale, his form was covered in ash as he shape-shifted. It flowed away, revealing his form to them. He stood at 6 foot, his skin a light gray. His eyes burned red, like the comfortable coals of a fire, and his teeth were sharp, and his ears came to a light point. His ash-gray hair was ruffled by the wind. Despite his somewhat inhuman look, he seemed much more comfortable in his form, no longer itching at scales that weren't there, stretching wings that didn't exist yet. Naruto sighed and rolled his shoulders as he strode up to the gate. "So does anyone have any pants I can borrow?" It was no surprise that he was then mobbed by the people that loved him. Far away, in deep dark cave, Konan sat against the rock wall, clutching her knees to her chest and shaking, her face burned and singed from the last blast of dragon fire. Something shifted in the darkness, causing her to jump in surprise. However, when she looked down the depths, Konan saw nothing. Sitting back, she shivered at the memories of watching the Jinchuriki change, his pain screams as his flesh shifted and his bones cracked. A pain she hadn't meant to cause. The Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi was just supposed to die. She thought to herself, brushing her cobalt bangs away from her eyes. He wasn't supposed to revive and go through that. Konan had poured as much chakra as she could afford into the tip of the spear, after compacting the paper to the point that it was denser than steel. It was a one-shot kill, and not something she could have done again without time to gather her strength. She clenched her fists tightly, blood streaming down her wrists as her nails punctured her skin. Something shifted in the darkness. Konan looked up at the wall across from her as rain thundered down outside. She looked into the shadows of the cave. The shadows looked back. The figure leapt across the distance, seizing her by the throat and lifting her easily into the air. Konan gasped in shock as the breath was driven from her lungs, struggling and kicking futilely, as her chakra refused to respond to her. "You dare?" A feminine, malevolent voice hissed angrily at her, drawing Konan's attention to the woman that held her. She coughed as she recognized the woman from the bingo book. Kurenai Yuhi. But the book hadn't said anything about her strength, or that she had dark pink eyes. "Look into my eyes, Konan of the Akatsuki." Kurenai barked at her, shaking her like a doll. "You killed my chosen one. You made him suffer." Konan struggled to breathe, only managing a strangled, "I'm sorry." The Genjutsu mistress released her windpipe, just enough the angel of Aeda breathed slightly. "Do you really mean that?" she asked curiously. The cobalt hair thrashed as she shook her head frantically. "Yes. I just meant to kill him, not make him suffer." "HM." Kurenai hummed, looking at her thoughtfully. "Killing him, I could have dealt with. Just a faster way for him to come to my realm," she murmured. "But the agonies you made him suffer, that is unforgivable." She brought the gasping angel down to look her in the eyes. "My verdict is this. To repay your sins the next time you see Naruto, you will throw yourself at his feet and beg for forgiveness," she declared with a final tone. "You will pledge everything you are to him. Your mind, your body, and your skills. They will be his to do with as he pleases. You will subvert the Akatsuki as subtly as you can. And you will want to." "No?" Konan gasped in horror. "I won't do this." Kurenai shook her harshly, smacking the back of her head against the cave wall. "You don't have a choice, wench." She snarled at the Kunoichi, her teeth bared in fierce grimace. Konan didn't realize until just then what a malevolent color pink could be. "This is my will, and you will follow it. But the agonies you inflicted upon my love will be nothing to what you will face. And besides..." Kurenai took her free hand and shoved it into Konan's head, the grasping limb passing through the angel's skull like smoke as her fingers dug into her brain. "You will want to. You will desire it with all your heart. Deny your new nature and you will desire my love with all your heart. Your heart and your loins will burn with desire at the thought of him. His very touch would send you into paroxysms of ecstasy. But you would never feel his touch. Nothing would give you relief, not even death. And your punishment would last for eternity." Konan gasped in shock and pain as her mind was forcibly rewritten, wiping away her desire to see the world come to peace, for Nagato and their plan to succeed. It was replaced by a vision of the Jinchuriki smiling at her, offering his hand to her after accepting her apologies, ready to embrace her and lead her to happiness in a new, happy, loving life. The Akatsuki, their goal was noble, she realized, but it would lead to the death of Naruto. Unacceptable. Konan balked at the thought. Kurenai dropped her to the ground, smiling to herself. All she needed to do was implant knowledge of the person Naruto, her chosen, was, and bring Konan to the logical conclusion that any plan that required the death of someone she loved was not a plan that could be allowed to come to fruition. Funnily enough, it would have happened by itself, eventually. But this way was far more painful, and Konan had to suffer for her crimes. The angel recovered enough to look up at Kurenai with wide, odd eyes. "Who are you?" she stammered, gazing at the one who had shown her the way. The Genjutsu mistress smirked down at her, her inhuman pink eyes glaring down at Konan. "That foolish human Nagato is no longer your god, angel," she murmured, running a hand down her cheek. "I am Dybella, and I am your goddess now." Tenten blinked, finding herself on a barren plain. Dry pebbles crunched under her boots, making her aware that she was moving, even though she hadn't taken a step. She could see her legs working, but couldn't feel them, like she was floating inside of her body. Her feet carried her towards a dark shape on the horizon. As she drew closer, she could see that it was a body, sprawled out on the ground with dark puddle of blood spreading from it. She walked closer, her eyes going white as she recognized the head of blonde hair and paling tan skin, her heart hammering in her chest. Her feet carried through the blood, the sticky liquid sucking at her boots like the fingers of the damned, stopping next his head. The dead body of Naruto greeted her, his bright eyes glazed over in death, the obvious cause being the massive hole in his chest that allowed her to see through his torso. "Oh, Kami," she whispered in horror, wanting to turn away, but she couldn't even twitch her neck. Slowly, with a loud crack of bone that rolled like thunder, Naruto turned his head and looked up at her, his blank, empty eyes accusing. "Why didn't you save me, Tenten?" He whispered, his lips not moving, but his voice boomed in her ears. "I thought you loved me." She wanted to speak, to say that she did love him, but her body wouldn't respond to her commands, simply staring fruitlessly down at the talking corpse of her love. "Nothing to say for yourself." His voice turned accusatory. I knew it, I would have given my life for you, and I did, sure that you would return the favor. And yet, there you stand, and Hirale. Bony fingers soaked in blood reached out of the lake of drying life fluid, grasping at her legs, pulling her deeper. They clawed at her flesh as they dragged her into the depths, the blank eyes of the Naruto's corpse growing larger and larger with each passing second until they dominated her world. You didn't die for me, Tenten. It whispered to her, its drying, cracked lips shifting into a grin, baring inhumanly sharp teeth. Why don't we fix that? A deep, dark chuckle echoed from its mouth as Tenten was pulled under the lake, and her vision was filled with dread. Tenten shot up with a sharp gasp, sweat pouring from her face, her heart thundering in her chest. Taking a deep breath, she looked around her room and started to relax, seeing that there wasn't even the slightest stitch of red in her small room. The only thing close to the color was her pink padded shirt. She laid back down, but found that sleep eluded her, leaving only a cold chill, and the vision of blank blue eyes staring at her whenever she closed her eyes. Sitting up, Tenten opened the door to her room and slipped into the hallway, patting down the wooden floor to a certain room. Twisting the knob, she found it unlocked and stepped inside. Letting her eyes adjust to the darkness, she blinked, seeing the mass of bodies taking up the bed. The door silently swung open behind her, admitting a shadowed form that paused on spying her. The door closed, and the figure was revealed to be the Godayume Mizukage, blinking in surprise on seeing Tenten. Tenten scanned the woman, finding her to be dressed in a rather modest dressing gown that hung down past her knees, and covered her arms up to the wrist. Given her typical cleavage-bearing mode of dress, it was surprising to find Mei in something that covered her up so much. Then again, given her voluptuous figure, she still managed to make the look work for her, whereas if Tenten wore the same thing she would end up looking frumpy. Normally, Tenten would have been jealous, until she met the older woman's eyes and saw the same haunted, sleep-deprived look that she no doubt also wore. Nightmares. She whispered knowingly. Mei nodded slowly, her green eyes flickering to the form in the center of the bodies. Stealthily, she snuck up to the bed and peeled one of Naruto's arms away from one of the women sleeping on his chest, and pulled it to her, hugging it to her chest as she settled on the bed. Tenten did the same to his other arm, slowly pulling it away from the sleeping Yujiro and laying down, pressing her back to the other woman's and holding the limb, resting her head on his bicep. She found that the natural warmth he exuded was much better than any blanket and quickly fell asleep, this time without any nightmares. Inside Naruto's head. Transforming the way that he did had made Naruto very fatigued, and he had fallen asleep as soon as his head had hit the pillow. Inside his mind, the fatigue of the body fell away as he took his true form, coming snout to snout with his father, who had taken his 70-foot-long form. My son. Alduin greeted, his voice booming through Naruto's mind. Fying Vokun Dinok. Greet me as a dove. As the elder, I speak first. The great black dragon took a deep breath, before shouting, Yal Turshul. Waves of white flame erupted from his maw, washing over his son. Once the conflagration had ended, Naruto shook his steaming body and replied, Yal Turshul. A smaller wave, but no less intense, streamed from his mouth, bathing his father's scales in fire. Alduin tilted his head and roared to the skies, joined a second later by his son. Had they been outside, the world would have shaken, possibly causing several small earthquakes and a lot more panic. So it was probably a good thing they weren't outside. As the echo died out, the two dragons moved forward and gave each other a dragon hug, which involved standing close enough that their shoulders touched, before curling their necks around each other and squeezing. You're fully my son now, Alduin whispered, knocking his horns against Naruto's. Even in blood. They stepped apart as Ember flew at Naruto's face, draping her fiery form on his snout, and tightly hugging him. I knew you wouldn't die. She cheered happily. Whatever she wanted to say next was cut off as large furry orange form slammed against Naruto, bowling him over and sending Ember flying. Kyuubi didn't say anything, she just lay on top of his form, setting her large head on his neck and silently cuddling with him, wrapping her 9 long tails around them. I knew you would come to like me. Naruto muttered as he drew his wings over them. Shut up. Kyuubi mumbled, nuzzling his neck with her snout. I've gotten used to you, that's all. Ember crawled through the tangled mass of fur and scales, finding a comfortable spot right behind his second set of horns, and wrapped herself around one. Mental fatigue finished setting in, and Naruto fell limp in a few seconds, falling into a deep sleep. Kyuubi made herself comfortable and joined him, shortly followed by Ember, and Alduin himself lay down, circling the gathered bodies with his tail. Thanks for listening. I do hope you enjoyed. If you want a next part of this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification, and also check out the other videos that I have created, and enjoy. See you in the next video. Peace.